Hello, this is Dr. Winkler again. We are still working on History 151G, trying to get finally through. Getting very late in the course. I want to tell you before I proceed, you have my complete admiration. You've put up with this, all the degradation, all the brutality in these lectures, and you're still with me. I am very impressed. Pat yourself on the back. Since we're not with you, I'm not with you, I can't pat you on the back. But nonetheless, feel yourself honored. Well, this should be our last lecture. And we're talking about another aspect of Asian history. It's modern China. China is an extremely important nation, as you know, in the modern world today. Still, the strongest economic power in the world happens to be the United States. Of course, the United States has very large military budgets, so hands down, we have this most powerful military structure anywhere in the world. But as far as economic clout is concerned, the United States is still number one, but number two is Asia. Number two is China. The economic impact of China is absolutely enormous. And obviously, when you have economic clout, you also have political clout. So to help us understand the last part of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, we do need to take a look at China, where China's coming from, and their importance in history. Well, let's take a look at it. The last time we were talking about China, we were discussing the Opium Wars, remember? Can I say, like I said before, this is not Britain's finest hour. Remember, Britain wants to sell opium. They're growing opium in places like India. They need a market for this. It is widely known in the 19th century that there can be real problems if people get hooked on opium. Where's your market? Well, China doesn't want cheap European goods. They have a very strong economy, but largely handicrafts economy. Rather than industrial goods, they have people weaving intricate silks that are quite comfortable when you wear them. They're quite spectacular when you look at them. And they think that cheaper goods coming from Europe, in this case Britain, will eventually degrade them. They'll drive out the quality goods with cheaper goods. And there's probably something to be said for this. Also, China is trying to deal with the addiction problem of many people in their country. If you can keep the source of drugs out of the country, then there's a much better chance that you can control people getting hooked on this. Opium is such an addictive drug that if people get hooked on it and they go into withdrawals, they'll suffer egregiously. I mean, it's terrible pain. What will you do under the circumstances to get another fix? Of course, sell your mother on eBay, throw your kids off a bridge. Sometimes you simply do anything. This can be very damaging into the family structure. This can be very damaging to the economy. A lot of people are going to be involved in crime. And also, this is degrading to people's health. As I told you when we were discussing the Opium Wars, that Britain essentially sent gunboats into various harbors, and the Chinese are not strong enough militarily to push them out. So you've literally forced these people to take poison in their societies. The reason why I'm making a big deal over this is that we do see in the 19th century, in the 1800s, we do see that there's a push by many Western powers to try to get an economic foothold in China. And if you get an economic foothold in China, the market there, because there's a large population and a big economy, the market there can be quite impressive. You can make a lot of money by going into China. So you want to get in there. So we find various enclaves, the Germans and the Portuguese, the British, among others, get in and start carving up little enclaves where they can trade in this port and other people trade in other ports. Well, they bring in a Western influence. I mean, the West come in with superior military technology, if nothing else, and they come in, and there are groups of Chinese who look at this and say there is a the Western influence is strong. We can do better by accommodating them, by becoming more Western ourselves. So they start to wear Western style clothing. Men start wearing suits and ties. Women start wearing Western clothing. They try to take on sometimes Western attitudes as far as the theater is concerned. And well, if you want to trade with these people, it's helpful if you learn a Western language. You can learn English, among other things. So we have a situation where China is becoming more westernized. The difficulty with this is a lot of the traditional Chinese say, well, wait a minute, man. You know, are we Chinese or are we not? Just these people, these other people have economic clout. Why on earth should we be paying so much attention to them? Why don't we just have our nation the way it is, our culture the way it is? So there's people that are accommodating, and I'm going to call these other people traditionalists. They just want to have it the way it is. Well, there's a major uprising in China. We tend to call it the Boxer Rebellion. My Chinese is non-existent, so I can't tell you what this is in Chinese. But essentially, it's called Righteous Fist. Righteous Fist, of course, a fist is a symbol of power. It's not a fist. It's strong. By darn, I'm going to come down on our enemies. The Westerners have translated these as boxers. People that are pugilists that can fight with their fists. That works out fairly well. Now, remember there are enclaves, various enclaves from various countries in China. And the Righteous Fist, the boxers, decide that they can attack the various groups. And sometimes you have a small group here, Westerners, a small group here, and a small group here. The boxers believe that if you come in, you can kind of pick them off. So we have the Boxer Rebellion. You can see the years. One of the ways I remember the Boxer Rebellion, I usually remember like 1900. It's a very easy year to remember. Yes, it doesn't start then. Yes, it doesn't end then. But 1900 is a good year for me. I can remember that very easily. Anyway, you're trying to keep foreigners out. Not all the Chinese are into hurting people. I mean, there's a lot of Chinese say, look, we don't have to like these people, but isn't there a better way to deal with them than actually using violence? There are times when some of these enclaves, these Western enclaves in cities, are literally besieged, and they're besieged for many days, sometimes weeks and months, where they go, oh my goodness, what's happening, and they can't get out of their buildings. Of course, they have some troops there, and the troops there are defending them. Can we say this is a time of great nervousness? One of the more famous Americans who happens to be in the Boxer Rebellion, actually he's in the Boxer Rebellion, he's in China during the Boxer Rebellion, is Herbert Hoover, a mining engineer who later served as President of the United States. His background is Quaker. And remember, Quakers do have a tendency to be pacifists. Well, the U.S. Marines come and talk to him. He's been living there. He knows some Chinese. His wife knows some Chinese as well. So they're in the area, and the Marines come and say, well, we need to be able to march and kind of take care or protect our interests over here. And they say, you know the area, Herbert Hoover, why don't you guide us over there? Well, so he does. I find this very, very, very amusing. He's a Quaker. He's leading Marines. And he's really nervous because the enemy's out there. Now, he never said he took a shot at anybody. But when they gave him a rifle, he really felt a lot more secure. I have the ability to defend myself. Well, Herbert Hoover's one of some Americans who did pretty good work over there. His wife, Lou Henry Hoover, she's riding around a bicycle carrying a pistol to try to defend herself. when some of the Boxers came after people in China. He and his wife defended them, keeping them from being killed. You see, what a lot of these people were afraid of is the Westerners, that these people that cooperated with the Westerners had gone too far, therefore they could be subject to persecution. Well, this fails. The Boxer Rebellion is a big failure. One of the reasons why it's a failure is it's not organized enough. It's kind of disparate groups. If you got everybody together at one time, they'd be very formidable. But it's disparate groups that are not exactly doing the same thing exactly at the same time. They lack the impact of a large number of people at the same time. The weaponry, even though the enclaves are from the West, the United States, other countries, are very small, they do have troops. They do have Western weapons, repeating rifles, those kind of things, which keeps the Boxers from being able to be largely successful. Now, notice the years of the Boxer Rebellion. Many countries have been important in China for many years. This is a time for imperialism. My goodness, they divided up Africa, chunks of Asia, large areas of the world. Why would they not come in and divide up China into colonies? The French, the British, the Portuguese, the United States taking their colonies. The difficulty is this, that one of the major actors in Asia is the United States. The United States, immoral statements won't go along with it. The United States thinks that spheres of influence probably pretty good. So rather than having China broken up into numerous colonies held by numerous nations, which could lead to numerous problems later on, when China would later on, of course, would want their independence, and they're going to have to fight a number of people or talk them into leaving. The fact that China is left relatively politically intact meant that it did not have to go through a phase of reunification. Sometimes we forget, as we look at American-Chinese relations, they're going way back when the United States were actually friends with China. The reason why we tend to forget this is that during the Cold War, during the Cold War, China is one of our arch rivals. So we don't spend a lot of time talking about them. Oh, they're really good guys. No, we don't do that very much. But we were friends early on. So China is, these economic enclaves are still there. They're enhanced. We have, as I mentioned, the various countries, and they control these ports and these cities, and they have trade in these areas. But they are not formal colonies. Well, China has looked at the situation that's been coming down for a long time, and they realize they've got a big problem. And one of the problems is that their regime, their government, is locked, going literally a couple thousand years, going way, way back to the early days of China, where you have a king, if you will, that's running the nation. Well, the rulers of China also have, I would call them their clique, their socio-economic groups, which are very high, very powerful. They're landlords, and they do have a tendency to be unjust to their people, unjust to the peasants, treat them very badly, and when the peasants get hungry, they don't care. A major step to modernize China is to modernize the government. We usually say the attempt to modernize China started in 1912, when you have the nationalists who are now trying to make China more progressive, more modern, and we tend to call this the Republic of China. Sun Yat-sen is kind of the, shall we say, the spiritual leader of this movement. A very nice looking gentleman. You can imagine he's had a lot of training in the West. He's not dressing like a Chinese, is he? He's, if you took that guy in downtown London, you'd say, well, he's a little bit darker than most of the people here. He looks like a good businessman. He'd be downtown Paris, speaks French. You'd say, look at this nice businessman. Can we say he's Western in many respects? He's been Westernized. His attempt has problems. He tries to make the Republic of China a true republic. One of the problems with this is that there's still a lot of economic, social, and political power being held in the upper classes. To make this into a true republic, would he not have to represent the interests of the lower classes? And they are huge. Of course, you'd had like one man, one vote. They would actually overwhelm the upper classes because the upper classes don't want this. They like their privilege. As much as Sun Yat-sen tried to modernize China to make it more like a Western republic, in reality, the social economic forces are so strong that if you are lower class, you're peasant in China, you're going to say, I don't see much difference. And some of the upper classes, the people who control society, they say, okay, we've removed the emperor and the empress. We've removed these kind of people in our government, but we still want to have control. So these are some problems that Sun Yat-sen has to deal with. His party, they call it the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang is the nationalist party. These are the people that are trying to push for reforms, but they always have to play ball with the upper classes. After he dies, you can see he dies in 1925. His heir, who essentially controls the Kuomintang after this time frame, is Chiang Kai-shek. Lives a long time. He's around for quite a while. Let's get some images of Chiang Kai-shek, not Mao Zedong. Yeah, Chiang. He likes to be seen in a military uniform. Yeah, he was a military leader. Early in his career, he was a military person. And later, of course, not terribly surprising, it's somebody with a military background. If you're talking about a volatile situation in a nation that is having problems as far as uprisings are concerned, then a man with a military background would have certain advantages over other people. Well, he has a similar problem. He does care for the lower class people, but there are just so many social forces against him that his progress is slow and quite frankly inadequate because he can't budge the upper classes. But he has to have the support of the upper classes in order to rule. Can you see the conundrum here? It's very clear. So it's up to him to try to modernize China, which he fails to do. And it's also up to him to try to control the rebellions that are going on in China. Chinese Civil War. The nationalists against the communists. Okay, we already mentioned who the nationalists are. Let's talk about the communists. We find this issue of rebellion very often in world history, literally since the advent of the Russian Revolution. We have a communist regime taking over. A lot of people give lip service to the ideas of Karl Marx. Remember, German intellectual, got, shall we say, invited to leave Germany, spent most of his time in the British Museum in London writing his books. He writes them in German. He is essentially one of the more strong proponents of giving the wealth and productive capability to the lower classes. You're very familiar with his ideas. Essentially what he's saying is this: the people who actually do the work, the people actually producing, should have the benefits of their production. And the upper classes, who probably inherited their wealth or just hire a factory overseer. They're sitting on their duffs in obscene luxury, while other people are suffering egregiously. According to Marx, it is just. It is the right thing that should happen to take the lower classes, and the lower classes can take over the means of production, and they can benefit directly from what they're doing. Can we say the communists are virtually despised everywhere? Simple reason for that is that the wealthy people are in control almost everywhere, and they look upon those people as a direct threat to their social and economic power. Why would the Chinese, at least some of the rebellious Chinese, turn toward communism? Look at the date when the Civil War actually gets started in 1927. I do believe strongly that the leaders, I got Mao Zedong, I'll talk about him in just a minute. I do believe very strongly that there is an idea that these people do buy into it. That the basic ideas of Marxism is good for the country. However, there's a Russian regime called the Soviet Union dominated by the communists. If you declare yourself communist, maybe Russia will look upon you as a potential ally. And in looking upon you as a potential ally, they're much more likely to support your movement. They're much more likely to send you money. They're much more likely to send you weapons. If you just call yourself rebellious Chinese, you can put all kinds of different statements on who you are, different monikers. But if you call yourself communist and you appeal to Marxist theology is the wrong word, Marxist ideology, and you can get help, therefore, from the Soviet Union. This is not just true of communist movements in China. It's true of communist movements in Korea. It's true of communist movements in Malaysia. It's true of communist movements in Southeast Asia, Laos, and Vietnam. Okay. Mao does believe essentially Marxism, but it is also convenient for him to do so. What are their gripes? Their gripes are huge. Going back centuries and centuries, thousands of years, we literally have this very depressed, economically disadvantaged, lower class people. They're working, breaking their backs in northern China to grow wheat, in southern China to grow rice. They work very hard, but they have to pay money to the landlords. They don't own their lands. They have no rights politically. They're just simply a subject people that can be brutalized. And their situation, for many of them, becomes intolerable. Many of them can't even feed their families. But any time you try to improve your situation, the people on the higher level of the economy are going to say, I'm sorry, you can't do this. So what are they going to do? Look at communist doctrine and rebel. The odds are so long. I mean, the upper classes are very much entrenched. They have a lot of money. They can buy troops. They can buy manpower. The way you can defeat these is by outsmarting them. One of the ways you can defeat them is simply not present a large army. You can have revolutionaries here and there. They rise up, they cause disturbances, they take shots at people. And then when the Kuomintang, the nationalists, come back with their army, trying to find who's making the trouble, you just kind of disappear. Either back into your hut saying, I don't know anything about that, or into the countryside. One of the ways that the nationalists try to deal with the communists, the rebellious people, is by excessive brutality. When there is a problem in a village, for example, you can come in and you can look for the perpetrators and everybody goes, I don't know who they are. So how about a retaliation? How about just slaughter a few people? You see, there's one thing, if I want to rebel, I put my life at risk. And you can call it suicide if you want to. If I push the issue hard enough, I'm going to eventually get shot. But on the other hand, what if in my actions, the reaction is going to get my family killed? See, that's a different matter. How about my actions get people in the village killed. It's a different matter as well, isn't it? So sometimes repressive regimes say this is a way you can hold this down. Large retaliation, sometimes for small actions. But there is a problem with this. In theory, that does work. And I'm sure there's a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to get my family killed. I'm going to watch what I do. But let's say you're somebody in that village, and maybe your family had nothing to do with this at all, and they come in and start shooting people. Then what do? You say, well, that's okay. No, no, no. You see, brutality does get some people to quit. But in a larger sense, brutality does have a tendency, in many instances, not all, does have a tendency to foment greater resistance. And in other words, every time you kill somebody, there's two somebodies to come to replace him. The way that the Kuomintang can control is literally have manpower in the villages. The difficulty with that is they don't have enough manpower. And then you get some very vicious leaders. Mao Zedong is one of the greatest brutal people literally in the 20th century, maybe in history. If you look at the level of human sacrifice, you look at the level of human loss, you look at the level of devastation and torment, this man is in a very elite class. We would have to include him as one of the modern brutal men in the same category with Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Some people even argued that if you add up the number of people that Mao killed, he is superior in numbers to both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Okay. Well, if you have a situation, let's get Mao up here for us. If you have a situation of here's Mao right here. Let's get him up a little more close. If you have a situation of competing leaders in a rebellion, there is going to be a tendency for the nice guys, the men who are, shall we say, a little bit more reticent to do damage. They're going to be pushed aside. They're going to become, shall we say, inferior in the entire matrix. But we get people that are powerful, get people that are vicious. They tend to rise because in an area of rebellion, if you are vicious, you do have a tendency, unfortunately, to be more effective. So Mao comes to the front, works his way out. Now, I'm a Cold War kid. I was raised during the Cold War. We were taught Cold War everything. And though I was always concerned about the Soviet Union, they taught us fear at all levels. Boy, I was really afraid of this man too. Because as the Soviet leaders had a hatred for the United States, Mao's hatred for the United States is extensive as well. In the Russian Civil War, the United States did send a few combat troops to help the whites fighting the Reds in the Civil War. So in a minor way, we were involved in supporting the old regime. Of course, the communists who won don't like us for that and don't like us very much at all. But the United States is more heavily involved in giving weapons and money to the nationalists. So Mao views the United States as a direct, serious threat to them, and he responds with great hatred to the United States. Doesn't hurt him at all that when he unleashed the Chinese army on the Americans in the Korean War, where he does severe damage to the Americans, he's pretty proud that he's doing that. We'll come to the Korean War in just a few minutes. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the resourcefulness of these people. Talk a little about the Long March. If you let me move it down. Okay, the Long March. Let's get a map for the Long March up here. The long march. Of course, there's going to be communist propaganda. Talk about the greatness and courage of these people. We have photographs. There were actually some Westerners, a few newspaper people that observed what was going on. So the documentation for this is actually very good. We have a very good idea of what went on. Let's go to a map. Sat helper, is that too challenging, too busy? Well, what had happened down here? And the big population centers, of course, down here where you have a lot of rice, and up here we have a lot of wheat. So these some of the rebellion does take place down in these provinces. Well, the Chinese, the Kuomintang, before the Japanese invade, can put a lot of their forces directly on top of these. And it takes a while, but the nationalist forces are virtually on, shall we say, on the verge of surrounding the communists. When you're surrounded, you can't get in. Support, and you're going to get annihilated. It's quite remarkable. Mao takes a desperate measure, a desperate step. Let's take our army before we're completely encircled out of down here, and let's get them on the other side of China. This is less densely populated. This is the hill country. When you tend to be in the mountains, it tends to be a little bit more difficult to get in there and get you out. Mountains are much more defensible than down in lower areas. But the logistics involved is absolutely stunning. This might be an exaggeration, might be a typo. When I was reviewing my notes for this lecture, I was thinking, wasn't it 5,000 miles? I guess if you, as the crow flies, you're going over like this. You can see on this map. The crow flies, it would be still a few thousand miles. 8,000 might be something exaggeration. But if you talk about them going back and forth and coming around, turning around and returning, you do have a tendency, this loop right here, to have a lot of miles. Can we say militarily this is probably the longest and greatest march ever? So, oh, wait a minute. I know you're good historians. Well, Genghis Khan was Mongolians on horseback. Yeah, the hordes of the Mongols, my goodness, they swept over Central Asia. Some of them, actually, Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, got as far as Russia. And for a while, Russia was actually an enclave under the Golden Horde. That's not one march, it's on horseback. Now, I appeal to your knowledge as historians, and you can correct me on this, but to my knowledge, this is the longest single march by a military group ever. Remember, I said that in class one time. Student said, wait a minute, is that really an army? Yeah, I think so. I didn't handle that well. I said, well, what do you have to be an army, a badge or something? No, this is an army, and this is a military march. They start out with roughly, what, 70,000 people? That's a considerable force, particularly as a rebellion. Now, of course, the nationalists know what they're doing. The nationalists know that they're moving up into another area. The nationalists have a good army. So the nationalists are going to try to hit them on the move. They do that many times. The nationalists are going to say, well, they're going up north. In which direction shall they go? You can see this loop right here. Essentially, they're trying to fool the nationalists. Well, we're going up here, so they hope the nationalists will deploy the forces here. And then you loop back down. But this takes so long. Yeah, maybe you fool the nationalists right now. But this loop takes so long that they're going to have the ability to try to interdict you all along the line. A lot of mountain combat. You've got to get through the gorge. You got to get through the canyon. You got to cross the stream. You got to get the bridge. It's stunning with all of the problems. How are you going to feed your people? How are you going to get food? So you start with 70,000 people. Many are killed. People die of exposure. You're up in the mountains and you don't have proper clothing. Can we say that by the time that the communist, the Mao Zedong, is leading his people, by the time you get up here, this, 70,000 people is down by 90%. It's down to about 7,000. My goodness. Stunning accomplishment. Well, a 7,000 man army isn't nearly as formidable as a 70,000 man army. But now you have an enclave. The nationalists, of course, the nationalists are fighting you. They're not going to give up on this. They're not going to say, good show, you got up there now we're going to leave you alone. That's not true at all. What the nationalists are going to do is they're going to continue to fight you. But they're never able to push Mao Zedong out of his mountain enclave up here. So there's little Chinese propaganda. Of course, the Chinese communists are proud of their accomplishments. So you got people marching. These are some very high mountains, very formidable areas. It's a most impressive feat. And we have, as you can see, a few photographs. This is Mao on I guess that's a small horse. Of course, one of the things that always amused me about this photograph is everybody's walking but him. I'm sure he did a lot of walking as well. Okay, so the communists are able to hold on. That's really the upshot of this story. Now, I should mention the length of time. I said it went from 1 year to another year. If that's from December to January, it's not very long. We usually say it's over a year, 370, 380 days. So this took a very lengthy period of time. Now Japan invades. One of the reasons why Japan invaded in 1937 is they say, the Chinese army, they're up in the mountains, they're fighting the communists up here. There's not going to be as many of them down near the coastline where we can come in. So actually the civil war in China between the nationalists and the communists, to the Japanese mind, at least the Japanese junta that decides to invade, they are the ones that say, this is to our advantage. So Japan comes in, as I mentioned, they occupy large areas of China. They do severe damage. Now the nationalists have a problem. They got the communists in one area, and they've got, let's go back to a map of China. They got the communists up here. I like that other map a little better. They've got this works. They've got the communists up here, but they got the Chinese down here. Excuse me, I said that wrong. The nationalists have the communists up here. They have the Chinese down here. Had the communists been more powerful, you could see perhaps that the nationalists would have got caught in a vice. Just my thinking. It's entirely possible. Had not the Japanese invaded China in 1937, that more likely the nationalists would have actually won the Civil War and eradicated the communists. Can we say, therefore, the invasion by the Japanese gave the communists some breathing room? And I think I can make a case for that. We have a triangular war. This is relatively odd in history, or unusual, I should say. We have a triangular war between Japan, the nationalists, and the communists. Triangular wars have challenging aspects. If you're fighting these people at the same time, and can you turn all your force on one? If you put all your force on one, you knock them down, then this group becomes stronger. So you put your forces over there, and so you knock them down, but this group becomes stronger. You see how challenging that can be. There was an attempt to have a ceasefire between the nationalists and the communists. Look, our biggest threat to our nation right now happens to be Japan. So let's quit fighting each other. And when we have defeated Japan, then we can come back and deal with our other issues. I would like to say that this worked well, but it worked somewhat. You see, the nationalists are never going to trust the communists. The communists are never going to trust the nationalists. However, this does give breathing space to the communists. The communists are very small in numbers and up in a province a long ways away at this time. But as the war goes on with Japan, and the nationalists the nationalists have got to deal with them down here. They've got to deal with the Chinese down here. They've got to deal with the Chinese over here. So it gives the communists a respite, a rest, where they can get more manpower, where they can build up their forces. And when the nationalists never beat the Japanese, the United States beat the Japanese. And when the United States beat the Japanese, they said, you're going to have to withdraw all of your troops from all of these places you've occupied. So all the troops from Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Burma, Taiwan, and China, Korea are going to have to be withdrawn. That wins the war. The nationalists have been beaten down quite severely. Well, the United States doesn't like the communists. At the end of the Second World War, the United States is probably the strongest economic power in the world. It clearly is. Well, do you want to send an army into Asia? The American army? Well, that's a very, I'll come back to this in another context. Very bad idea. But they want the nationalists to win. They hate the communists. So the United States sends money and it sends equipment to help the nationalists. What happens? Okay, the nationalists have been beat down. Large loss of life. Can we say the Chinese are sick of war? But now the Chinese communists, who are better supplied than they had been, getting weapons from the Russians, are able to defeat the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek has numerous problems, one of which is he's trying to placate the upper class people. And he's trying to get them on his side, and sometimes they are fair weather friends, and sometimes they are good friends. But he has a restive population. You see, is there a possibility that other people rise up? Is there a possibility you have more communists or other socialist groups that would like to overthrow the government? Chiang's position is so challenging that he is fearful that a rebellion will take him over. While if you're fighting the communists, and the communists are very good, should you not have your best combat units, your most loyal combat units, fighting the communists? That makes perfect sense. However, the other units that are available, Chiang Kai-shek thinks are not as loyal. In fact, they could be a problem. In fact, you could have the military destabilize your system and throw you out. So when he needs his best units up on the borders, up in these areas, fighting the communists, he has them back protecting his political reality. So the communists are not fighting the best Chinese units, they're fighting the worst. Finally, the rebellion spreads, the communists get more and more manpower, and finally, we usually say it ends in October 1949. The communists now overthrow the state, and the communists are now in control of China. All the nationalists can do, Chiang lives for a long time after that. He has a wife by the name of Madame Chiang. They go over here to Taiwan. And of course, China says this is an integral part of China. The nationalists say, no, 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 your communists are not the legitimate government. Since Mao Zedong does not have a navy, doesn't really have the ability, particularly early on, to send combat troops over here, storm Taiwan, and take it by force. You see, Chiang's going to be able to hold them off. One of the reasons why Mao never really can consider doing that is the United States Navy is still supporting the nationalists, even though Our big ally gets shot, literally goes down. Now the U.S. Navy is in a position to, we send our ships through here. We still do this over in the 7th Fleet in the Pacific, over in this area. So there is no attempt by Mao to take Taiwan. Even to this day, the Chinese government really wants Taiwan to be part of their government, be part of their state. But even with a lessening of tension over the decades after the death of Mao Zedong, we still have this standoff. Incidentally, there's a number of times during the Cold War, after the collapse of the nationalist Chinese on the continent in 1949, a number of times, I remember one like in 1958, where it seemed like Chiang was trying to provoke a war between the United States and China, sending out his people on small islands here close to China that the Chinese would view as a threat, the Communist Chinese would view as a threat, and maybe if they would retaliate, that the United States Navy would come in and then you can bring in the United States into a war. Whoa. That never happened, but even though Chiang is an ally of the United States, can we say he's not exactly the best kind of ally that we want, because we want peace. Now there's egg on the face of the United States, because we supported the nationalists in this war, and they lost. Now, the largest single country in the world in terms of population is China. And now it's gone communist. Not only do we have the Soviet Union, who hate us, we also have China that also hates us. And taken together, this is an enormous power block. In the repercussions in the United States, in the newspapers, in 1949, people said, who lost China? President of the United States, Truman, said, well, try to blame other people. But he's embarrassed because whatever he did was not sufficient to save China. And now we have another dagger pointed directly at the United States. When he has an opportunity the very next year to try to show American resolve in fighting communism, he does so. This is the Korean War. Let's go to Korea. The Korean War. Let's put it on a map. Korea. We do see this in the Cold War. Let's go back to this map. We do see this in the Korean War. Excuse me, in the Cold War. Let me say this right. In the Cold War. The United States is victorious. The Soviet Union is victorious in fighting both Germany and Japan. Well, what do you do with the areas you occupy? In Europe, they divide Germany up into zones of occupation. The French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians. And when they do this, you have joint ownership of a nation. In Berlin, it's the same thing. The French, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets are controlling Berlin. We forget they did the same thing in Austria. They divided Austria up into zones of occupation. Austria was a German ally during the Second World War. So they divided up, once again, occupation zones, including a division of people. In the Soviets get the eastern part of Austria. You go into downtown Vienna, the main city of Austria. You do have these enclaves as well. So let's do this in the east as well. So remember, Korea was taken by Japan in 1910. In 1945, Japan's out. Well, Korea is not an ally of Japan. Korea hates Japan. But rather than simply allowing Korea to find its own destiny, well, of course, you're going to, if you withdraw the Japanese, then who's actually controlling are going to have power in Korea. During the Cold War, this is viewed as a good idea. We will divide Korea into zones of occupation. These advancing maps are kind of fun, but it's giving us more information than I'm hoping for right now. Notice this changes. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy this. Let's see if we can get one without all this moving around. This is where I was at before. You divide the nation, the country. It's a peninsula, as you can see, right along the 38th parallel, north and south. So the zone of occupation will now be by the Soviet Union up here in the north, and by the Americans down here. Well, there are communists, there are rebellious groups operating in Korea. Would it not be nice for the Russians, the Soviets, to control, to have an ally out here that's communist? The United States is a little bit afraid that if they build up the South Korean army too much, that this will destabilize the peninsula. Because we do know that the South Koreans wouldn't mind unifying the country under their authority. So if you have too much of an army up here, down here, the chance of them going on the offensive up here is much enhanced. While the Soviets are building up a very fine army up here. They have Soviet tanks and artillery, weapons. They build up a very fine army. Now, from the standpoint of both the communists and the North Koreans, the fact that the United States did not build up the army in the South, the fact the United States decided in 1949, well, let's leave and let you deal with your own situation. They're viewing this as the United States doesn't care. Now, in the swing of things, does Korea make a lot of difference to the United States? Not economically, not socially, not even politically. Now, of course, we don't want communism to spread anywhere. But if Korea's lost, the United States hasn't lost much. See, we're still occupying Japan. So people do have a tendency to say that this was not in the United States' best interest to become involved here. Of course, Truman is very embarrassed because he lost China. So he wouldn't mind having a show of force. In June, oh boy, these maps are all too busy, got too much material in them. Let me just go to a map of Korea. All right, this is a modern map of Korea. Well, that's a modern map of South Korea. It's not much detail in North Korea. 38th parallels right along here. The United States has withdrawn. So June 1950, the communists in North Korea say, let's go have a party. And they invade. The largest city, the largest economic enclave in Korea is Seoul. This is the major city down here. There are other important cities. Seoul's the most important one. It's close to the 38th parallel. Within a few days, literally. The communists come down. They're using Soviet tanks. They come down here and they take Seoul. The South Korean army was not well trained. The United States didn't bother with that so much. They're not as well armed. They put up a good show, but they're outclassed, definitely. So the North Koreans just simply want to occupy the peninsula. So they're going to come down here. Now maybe go back to these other busier maps. Let's follow the action. Nah. Let's follow the action. Maybe I can't. Okay. The war starts out. The North Koreans. Can I freeze this? I guess I can't. Yeah, it's still. Okay. What happens is this. The North Koreans invade. The roads, this higher hill country right here, the roads coming down here are shall we say, easier to come down. So there we have, they send their tanks, they send their trucks down largely on the west. The nearest military force is over in Japan. These guys are not ready for combat. Quite frankly, a lot of Americans really enjoy occupying Japan. Their money goes a long ways. You don't have to have clean your own boots. You can throw a coin at a kid, he'll clean your boots and be glad to do it. You don't have to clean your own room. The small amount of money, the Japanese would be pleased to clean your room and fix you dinner or these kind of. Oh, this is a great place to be. These men, though they're technically combat troops, aren't really ready for this. And the United States starts sending in forces piecemeal. Truman says, get people over there to stop this. There's a group of men called Task Force Smith, and they're over here. They try to block a road. The North Korean tanks come down here, the Soviet tanks. The Americans are using bazookas, anti-tank weapons that were effective in the Second World War, but the armor on the T-34 tanks used by the North Koreans, you simply take these things, shoot them, and the missile just bounces off them. They're literally pushed aside. As they push down as the North Koreans push down the peninsula, the United States and its allies, talk more about that in 1 minute, send down forces. And you get down, let's go down where the map gets us again. Gets us down after the invasion. This is the end of the war. Okay. 38th parallel. This is the Pusan perimeter right down here. Pusan is a major city right here. It's virtually the only city in Korea that was not obliterated, or shall I say severely damaged during the Korean War. I've never been to Korea, but I understand if you go to Pusan, you're seeing a pretty nice place. What it really looked like. Well, I said America and their allies. This is the only time this has happened in the history of the United Nations. United Nations, as you know, was formed at the end of the Second World War. It's a little bit like the old League of Nations. It was formed at the end of the First World War. Their attempt was to get nations to come together, to talk about problems, to make sure war does not take place. There are numerous insurrections, uprisings, and wars since 1945 in the world. One of the ways you can stop aggression is obviously by sending combat troops. In every other instance, there's always a group someplace saying, wait a minute, which side are we on? So this is the only time that the United Nations has ever deployed combat troops. And the only reason why this worked is that the Russians were boycotting the meetings. The reason for this is that the Americans are saying the nationalist Chinese on the island of Taiwan are representing the nation of China. Well, the Soviets are saying, no, that's just a bunch of guys out on the island. The actual nation is being supported is the communists, it's Mao Zedong. A boycott under these circumstances was a very bad idea. So the Soviet delegates aren't there, so they can vote without him. On the Security Council, they can get a unanimous. So it is voted that the UN will become involved. Can we say that the UN effort is actually puppets of the United States? Britain sends a brigade. France sends a battalion. Some other nations send literally handfuls of people, sometimes a few observers. The real UN force is the United States. Well, the United States is able to hold the perimeter, the Army and the Marines. Goodness, this is getting me. Where I go, it's the same thing. Okay, the United States and the South Koreans primarily are able to hold the Pusan perimeter, which is right down here. The North Koreans have actually shot their wad. They've gone a long ways. They've suffered casualties. The tanks are broke down. General MacArthur, we met very briefly when we were talking about Japan, U.S. general, decides I'll do an end run. So he sends the Marines, see Incheon right here. This is September 1950. He sends the Marines to land right here at Incheon. You land at Incheon and you move forward. The North Korean army is down here. There's virtually nothing to protect this end run. So with ease, there's combat, there's fighting going on. But with ease, the United States can move towards Seoul. And they can cut the supply lines, these roads that come down from North Korea to support the army. With this attack, the North Koreans realize they got a big problem. So they make a run for it. In other words, they almost dissolve. They simply try to get back up here before they're entirely cut off. They lose their tanks, they lose a lot of their equipment, and they retreat up into here. Well, it looks like an easy conquest at this point, does it not? The United States and the South Koreans retake Seoul. Wow, fantastic victory. Rather than stopping the 38th parallel, they're going to reunite the North and South militarily. So they push up here. And the United States retakes, I shouldn't say retakes, we never had it before. They take the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang. And maybe I can show you this. And the United States goes back up here. You see the Yalu River. The Yalu River is right there. This is the river between China and Korea. MacArthur actually starts believing his own mystique. He has been so successful against long odds. Back in 1944, when he sends U.S. troops to invade the Philippines. The other commanders are saying, you know, we got problems, this might not work. It worked spectacularly. Yeah, you got to fight for Korea, for the Philippines, but in reality, what could have been an embarrassment to the United States in the defeat ends up being a stunning victory. MacArthur has been in Asia for decades. He thinks he understands the Asian mentality. As he's pushing farther north, as he's pushing way up here, so there are people saying, wait a minute, aren't we overextending ourselves? He says, we got no problems. Yeah, our men are tired, the equipment's wearing out, but we've got no real problems because the North Koreans are beaten and the Chinese will not come in. You're going to bet your life on that? Mao Zedong cannot believe the Americans think that he's going to sit there and watch this happen. Mao can't believe it. You people are coming up here. You have a foreign army. You do not mean us any good. We've just barely taken over this country. We're still solidifying our situation. And we're going to allow you to march all the way up to our borders and not do anything? He even says this, what would the United States do if they had a belligerent ally that marched right up to our borders? Would we sit and watch them? Well, according to him, we'd probably retaliate as well. The United States is pushing up on the west side of the peninsula, and there's some Marines over here on the east side. Once again, why are you marching up the west side? Well, because the hill country's on the east, and there's more roads over here. In November, the U.S. intelligence, November 1950, the U.S. intelligence say, we have indication in the hills up here, there are maybe several 100,000 Chinese troops that had crossed the Yalu River. Once again, MacArthur knows about this. His intelligence people talk to him, and what they're saying, he already said, they won't come in. This is the threat. Well, about Thanksgiving time, late in November, this is not a threat. The Chinese deliver one of the most vicious and humiliating defeats of the U.S. military in our history. The Chinese come out with thousands of people. We find out our equipment is inadequate. The oil we use for machine guns, for example, is a heavy oil, and it freezes up in very cold weather in North Korea. There are times when the temperatures go way below zero. There's times when the temperature goes to 20 below. There are times when Americans freeze to death. When the guns freeze up, you got a big problem. And the Chinese come in very large numbers. They like to attack after dark. The American air power is really negated when you attack after dark. So it's very cold and you start using your weapons and the weapons freeze up. This is a very, very bad scenario. What happens is all the Americans can do is run. I mean, they're shot up. I mean, there's an interesting book called The River and the Gauntlet, where an American military historian had interviewed these guys what their experiences were like. They're getting on trucks. They're just trying to drive out as fast as they can. The Chinese are on the hills. They're shooting down at them. Heavy casualties, large numbers of prisoners. And the Americans don't stop running until they've gone back beyond the 38th parallel. The Chinese retake Seoul. And now, if you can get on the map here, this is the end of the war. Thank you. Okay, beginning of the war, North invades, the counterattack. Okay, up here. The Chinese come back, kick us way down here, and then we turn around and slog all the way up. We do retake Seoul. A war of movement had actually ended by early, like February 1951. The war is going to go on until July 1953. That's like 2.5 years. And there are these hills in Korea, these very unpleasant hills that the Americans are going to have to retake, and the South Koreans, one after another. They slog their way up. Very costly battles. Yeah, we have bombers. Yes, we have fighter planes. But the Chinese are well dug in, so we fight up here. One of the reasons why we're not making a big deal over the Korean War, and Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, because it's sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam. We tend to remember Vietnam, World War II very well. We don't remember Vietnam nearly as well. I've said this all wrong. Let me start over again. It's sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam. We pay attention to World War II. We pay attention to Vietnam. We do have a tendency to kind of forget Korea in the middle. One of the reasons for this is later on when the collapse is the wrong word, when the Chinese decide they want to be friendly and not be viewed so much as a belligerent power, starting in the late 1970s. The United States now would like to look more carefully at making China a friend and talking about the vicious combat between Chinese troops and the American troops doesn't lean very much in that direction. So the United States suffers a terrible defeat. Now, one of the reasons why I'm going to make a big deal about this is not just understanding Chinese history, but to a certain extent understanding Vietnam. There are similarities between the two experiences for the Americans, one of which is you have an ally that is corrupt and not dependable. You have an enemy that can throw a lot more weight at you than they have. And you think you can actually pull this off. Well, the Americans say that this ends up being a draw. Essentially, the armies are where they were at the beginning. But they did keep them from coming on down. However, right here, you have a peninsula. The U.S. Navy is here and here. The only fighting, therefore, can take place here. In Vietnam, it's a different scenario because the North Vietnamese have the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which goes into Laos and Cambodia, areas that are far away from the coast where the Americans do not have the ability to control this. Okay. U.S. suffers a severe defeat. Well, when Mao Zedong dies in 1976, there was a question, of course, among American thinkers. In reality, who's going to come to power again? I was worried about one issue. One of the more powerful men in the Chinese government was Lin Piao. Fortunately, I think he did not get control of the government. But Lin Piao had a son who was killed by the Americans in the Korean War. I would view from that standpoint that he is not anybody to like the United States. And this could be another extension, if you will, of the Cold War, when you have that much hatred. that goes on between the United States, between China and the United States. Well, let's look at what Mao was doing in China. Mao is largely controlling a very large agricultural nation. The Chinese are extremely hard workers, they're intelligent, have very good work ethic. But to make China a powerful nation, Mao Zedong believes you've got to have industry. Well, he can do a lot of things to help that, can he not? He can invest in mining, he can invest in manufacturing, he can bring in coal, he can bring in iron. I remember when I was a kid, I'm in grade school, we had what we called the weekly reader. I don't know if those exist anymore. They were graduated. For my second grade weekly reader, for example, it was much less of a challenge than by the challenge. It was a little bit easier reading than by the time I got in the 5th and 6th grades later on, which is obviously you graduate the readers on the basis of people's ability to read them. These weekly readers were trying to get us up to date on what's happening. I do remember a few of these things, like when the new cars came out in September of the year. Oh, we have these new cars coming out, and Americans are going to rush out there and buy those cars. Good point. But they also mentioned China. And according to my weekly reader, the Chinese were trying so hard to increase iron and steel production that people were actually trying to get a kiln or whatever you would need in the backyard and to try to get a little more iron, melt a little more ore or whatever, get more iron that way. I have a hard time believing that if that did go on, that in effect that made much difference at all. But the Great Leap Forward is an attempt by Mao Zedong to get the Chinese more industrialized so they could have more railroads, more factories, more weapons, better tanks, and of course later better aircraft as well. Well, how do you do this? One of the problems with the Chinese, because they're not using an awful lot of machinery in their agriculture, some of the problems with the Chinese is this, that though they work very, very hard, without a lot of machinery in the agricultural sector, the yields have a tendency to be fairly low per person. Had Mao used more machinery, the yields would have been higher. You would have had a surplus. As it was, the surplus was virtually artificial. He wants to have more food to go to the cities, to the industrial areas. You have more food there, then people can specialize in the manufacturing, heavy industries, and iron and coal. But the surplus is largely illusional. It's largely an illusion. So the Great Leap Forward is an artificial famine, but it is a real famine, where he's taking food out of the agricultural sector and putting it into cities. So the people in the agricultural sector, though they're growing adequate for their needs usually, are now hurt badly. Sometimes this is called the Great Chinese Famine. As I mentioned, it's artificial. This is not because we had a plague of locusts. This is not because we've had floods. This is not because we've had questionable weather that has a tendency to destroy our ability to produce. This is actually taking food out of the mouths of people. Almost everywhere I look, there are differences in the number of people that died in China during the famine. Maybe even these numbers I looked up, I've read about, in reality, are artificial. Maybe that there are lower estimates and higher estimates. Sometimes when I introduce the 20th century in my classes, I'll talk about like the beginning of the 20th century, one of the most vicious and costly centuries in the history of the world. Starting with 1914, World War I, you got World War II, you got the Holocaust, you got the Korean War. In a half century, can we say largely between 1914 And 1964, with all of these horrible things going on, the loss of life is almost unprecedented in total numbers any time in history. And I would take that up to include the Chinese famine in the early 19, that actually spills over in the early 1960s. So this 50-year period is really quite vicious. Let's talk a little about the Vietnam War. Yes, the United States is fighting Vietnam. Yes, the United States has a lot of combat with Vietnamese. On the other hand, China is involved here as well. China sends large numbers of workers to help support the Chinese military, the North Vietnamese military in the north, so that can free up more men to go down and fight the Americans in the south. China also sends observers. China also sends military personnel to help direct the North Vietnamese in their warfare against the United States. A lot of times the equipment used by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are weapons from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is helping, no doubt about that. But they're also weapons and artillery pieces that are on the Soviet model, but they're manufactured in China. Of course, Vietnam is part of our course as well. Let's take a brief look. Now, the time frame when the Chinese were actually having people on the ground, at least in North Korea, North Vietnam, is like 1965 to 1971. This is kind of the height of the war. The Americans didn't want to believe that the issue between North and South Korea was one of various peoples fighting each other for control of the state. They also did not want to believe, the Americans also did not want to believe that Vietnam was also, at least in many issues, was in effect a war where you have lower classes, once again, against the upper classes. A little bit similar to what we actually have already seen in China. Notice that the boundary between North Vietnam shares a very large boundary with China. Can we say if China wants to make sure nothing, or what they want to change what's happening in Vietnam, they can do so. Also in Korea, we have kind of a cheap dictator who's been bothering a lot of people recently in North Korea because he is making nuclear weapons. He's trying to figure out delivery systems when he can actually bother the United States and other people. Well, notice this huge boundary, this huge border that Korea shares with China. If China, and of course China is the biggest trade partner of Korea, yeah, the United States and other countries can put an embargo on goods coming into North Korea. But if the Chinese really want to change it, they can. So we do have to remember the importance, shall we say, of China in a lot of issues even today. Well, there are uprisings after the Second World War. When the Japanese were down here, they're kicked out. France comes in. France, and before the war, had owned French Indochina, which is this area here, North and South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They want to come in and make this a colony again. But the Viet Minh, the communists, want them out. This is called the First Indochina War. Okay, the first war in Vietnam. That's the First Indochina War. It's the first war in Korea, in Vietnam. I'm getting all mixed up. I'm sorry about that. And the French lose. Now the French are supported by the United States. The United States send money. They send weapons. And in 1954, after the The French had fought here for 9 years, suffering more than 70,000 dead. Finally, the Viet Minh are successful up here. They draw a line. We like doing this on the 17th parallel, which is about right here, and the North Vietnamese are up here, and the South are up here, or down here, I should say. And what the North Vietnamese want is to take their nation and unify it into one nation. The United States is concerned about this. Now, Vietnam is a little bit like Korea. In no sense is this within our most important spheres of interest, that the United States really has to have this. But can we say there's another issue? Truman wants to show his moxie. So one of the reasons, I'm not saying this is the only one, he wants to fight in Korea. There's a new president of the United States. His name is John Kennedy. He's not the youngest president to serve in the office of the presidency, but he's the youngest man to be elected to that office. Let me explain that. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest man to serve, but he served because McKinley was assassinated. And when McKinley was assassinated, then Teddy Roosevelt, became president. So he's the youngest serving president. When he's reelected a few years later, in 1904, he is not the youngest to be elected. In any event, I'm making this much more complicated than I need to. John Kennedy is viewed as a lightweight. And in the Cold War, like Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, is taking a look at the Americans and say, can we intimidate these guys? See, the president before Kennedy was Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the head of the Allied forces in World War II. He's a military man. He's one tough dude. However, he's gone now, and you have this lightweight. Well, John Kennedy doesn't want to be in a position to act like he's being pushed around. We have a crisis in 1961. It's called the Berlin Crisis. When, remember, these zones of occupation, you have the Soviet zone of occupation and everybody else. The doctors, the important people economically in East Germany have business. You make more money in the West. So you simply go over into Berlin. You go from the East, the Soviet zone, into the West, the other zones, the American zones. Well, the Soviet Union says, heck, we're losing too many people. So the East Germans make the wall, the Berlin Wall. It exists until, what, 1989. Well, is this a crisis? Sure it is. What happens is that John Kennedy says, I got to act tough. He deploys the National Guard. There's no war over there, but he deploys the National Guard. Well, I'm tough. I'm going to show my moxie. I'm going to get more combat troops in West Germany. Well, the Soviets aren't invading West Germany, but he's showing what he's doing. Now, let's say something else about Vietnam. Vietnam, as we take a look at, remember, it was divided between the Communist North and we say the Free South on the 17th parallel. What Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Minh up here, he wants to unite his entire country, and he wants foreigners out. He wants the French influence out, and he wants the lower class people to have land reform so they can throw out their landlords and control their nation. On paper, this looks pretty good, but everybody knows that Hanoi, the North Vietnamese, are in fact allies to the Communist Chinese and also the Soviet Union. So, at the peace negotiations in 1954, the French and the Americans later on will say this: we will allow free elections. It takes a few years. We don't have everything more stable. So late 1950s, there's supposed to be free elections. The U.S. intelligence people go over to South Vietnam and they say, you know, an election, we might lose. In an election, these people down in South Vietnam might actually vote to become reunited with these people up here. So the vote on reunifying the country never took place. That's when the North Vietnamese say, well, this is how we're going to unite our country. We're going to have to do so militarily. So starting in the late 50s, they start to send infiltrators down into South Vietnam. Initially, what these people are trying to do is organize local people in combat groups, uprising. We call this the Viet Cong. Get the local people to fight against the landlords, the nobles that are actually controlling this area, and will be able to destabilize the government and throw them out. Well, the South Vietnam is actually corrupt. Their officials are on the take. A lot of times the people in control of the military, we can call them warlords, but when the United States gives them money, a lot of times what these people do, they'll pocket the money rather than use it for the purposes which it's intended, maybe to help the people, maybe to help the military. So this is something that's there's a problem. There's a big problem. There's a chance for this to collapse. So John Kennedy, once again, got to act tough. He doesn't send combat troops, but he sends advisors. He sends advisors to tell the South Vietnamese how to fight. These people down here in South Vietnam are just don't have their heart in it as much. As time goes by, Kennedy sends more advisors. By 1963, Kennedy has 17,000 men who are there trying to advise and support the South Vietnamese. Well, they can't even keep a stable government. The military, one after another, takes and fights and relieves the other people. Politically unstable, socially unstable. The will of the people, if you want to call it that, is not terribly good for having somebody else come in like the United States. Well, didn't we just get rid of the French? Why do we want the Americans coming in? On the 22nd November 1963, John Kennedy is assassinated. What would have happened had he remained president? His little brother, Robert Kennedy, who worked very closely with him as the president, said that he doesn't really know what they would have done, but this is what they were planning on doing. We can't win this war. We can't win this war. We're mired, corrupt. It's not in our best interests. We don't want to look like we're a bunch of wimps that backed out. But what they were planning on doing, cut a deal. Make a deal with the Viet Minh or say, okay, we have a ceasefire, which everybody knows that the enemy will not keep. And we say we've made a peace agreement, and as a peace agreement, now the Vietnamese can take care of the situation and leave. And always leave and allow them to face the music. But John Kennedy dies. And now a new president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. He was vice president. Now he's president. Lyndon Johnson is very much progressive. Looking back at the lead of Franklin Roosevelt, he has a social agenda. Now we get some of the things from him like Medicare and Medicaid, which you and I are quite familiar with. But he views that if he has a debacle, if he has an embarrassment internationally, in reality, this will hurt his domestic agenda. And he will not be allowed to get everything passed like he wants to. So rather than backing out of Vietnam, we've had men for a long time, he decides to ratchet it up. In 1964, William Westmoreland, an American general, is sent to Vietnam as a fact-finding issue. And he says the South Vietnamese will collapse in 6 months unless we actually get U.S. combat troops. So starting in 1965, the United States starts sending Marines and the Army, combat troops, to support the regime in South Vietnam. At this time frame, Lyndon Johnson believes that the North Vietnamese, can we say, being backed by their Chinese allies and their Russian friends, that they decide not to back down. But see, Lyndon Johnson thinks they will. Look what happened in the Second World War. Look at our ability. I mean, he believes that, like when the American troops are driving through France in World War II, and the Parisians and everybody else, oh, vive l'Américain, bring you wine, and the girls kiss you, and you just show the American flag and everybody's glad to see you, because you are looking for freedom rather than repression. When the Americans show up in Vietnam, this is not the case. They don't care. People go, okay, here we go again, somebody like the French. So waving the American flag doesn't simply work. However, Lyndon Johnson thinks all he has to do is send some troops, get a threat, send a few air bases, get the U.S. Navy plying the waters out here, and the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese will simply negotiate and will resolve this. You see, the Americans believe that nobody would be stupid enough to fight them. Let's take a look at the North Vietnamese. They fought the French. They fought a modern, technically advanced army, and they won. They look at the Americans and say, how stupid would you have to be to send armies over here and get involved in this mess where you could never win? When the Viet Minh are fighting the French, the First Indochina War, the Second Indochina War is what you and I call the Vietnam War. Fighting the French in the First Indochina War, they said this: you will kill us on a ratio of like 10 to 1. For every Frenchman we kill, you will kill 10 of us. Wow, you'd think you couldn't possibly sustain the military in that manner. In reality, what the North Vietnamese are saying, this is Ho Chi Minh saying, yes, 10 to 1, and you will get tired of it before we will. Can we say a democracy does not have the same staying power as a dictatorship? If a democracy has the will of the people, it has to consider the will of the people. In reality, the people will get tired eventually. But if you have a dictatorship where no dissent is allowed, where nobody can even say they're tired of the war, can we say that dictatorships tend to have a greater staying power? Yeah, we can say that very easily. So at the same time, from Lyndon Johnson saying, I will negotiate, the North Vietnamese army is coming down here, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and deploying to various areas of South Vietnam. Now we got a war. Over time, the Americans send more troops. Of course, we appeal to our allies. The United States like to get involved in large treaty organizations. One of the more famous is NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is largely meant to intimidate the Soviet Union into watching itself. And so we have allies like the Belgians, the Dutch, the British, the French, the Italians, the Canadians. Now, that's a hot spot, but there's something as well. Let's get a map here, which we call SEATO. SEATO is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Our allies including Australia, our allies, what was there, 4 of them? I'm trying to remember, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines. Some of these areas are our allies. And the idea is now to watch China's expansion. So we appeal to the organization. And the Koreans send combat troops, ROK, Republic of Korea. And they send combat troops down to Vietnam. There's not large in number. They're good. They're pretty vicious dudes. We do not talk the nationalist Chinese from Taiwan to come down and send combat troops. Because one of the things that they don't want to do is just fight the Vietnamese. They want to take the war back into China and march up and invade China. So they're kind of a loose cannon. Another one of our allies is the Australians. I've already mentioned how extremely good the Australians were as combat troops in the First World War, how extremely good they were in the Second World War. And their reputation is enhanced literally in Vietnam. Now, Australia doesn't need a big army, so it doesn't have a big army. Highly professionalized. And they come in and they do really good work. They're much more efficient than the Americans. I don't want to put the Americans down because we're very good as well. But every time you're out on an operation, the Americans always have to stop to have a cigarette. It slows you down. If you have the tobacco habit and you're in the Australian Army, well, that's tough. You're gonna have to have a nicotine fit before you're going to be able to stop and light up. You see, just little things of efficiency does have a tendency to enhance their reputation as being very good. Well, the war is very, very challenging. Can I get down here? I'm not sure that's the best map for my purposes. There's a trail we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What's misleading, and this is a German map. This doesn't have the Ho Chi Minh Trail on it. Anywhere you have supplies coming down here. Supplies coming down here. And it's a highway, literally. You can call it the Ho Chi Minh Trail if you want to. There are trail aspects to it. Sometimes you have highways where you have trucks coming down. The North Vietnamese are so efficient that a lot of the material is brought down on bicycles. I'm not saying you hop on the bicycle and you pedal on down here with a pack on your back. But I am saying you take the bicycle and you load it down as much as you can with whatever military materials you need, weapons, ammunition, that kind of thing. And then the person stands off to the side and holds the handlebars and pushes the bicycles all the way down here. When the United States invaded Cambodia in 1970, we take an incursion across here. My first cousin was involved in this attack. I don't want to spend a lot of time asking questions about the war, but if he's willing to volunteer information, I will certainly listen to him. He said when they went in here, actually, there's bicycles everywhere. Now, we have tremendous power. The United States and its allies has tremendous power. Bombers, and, ground attack, and artillery. It's awfully hard to defeat a guy on a bicycle. The United States is trying to fight the war a little bit like the Korean War. Maintain it in one area. Let's go to we got the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Very, very good right here. So come down here and you can use this as staging areas. The United States is trying to keep the war contained in South Vietnam, while the North Vietnamese, using their combat troops, have staging areas here in Laos and in Cambodia. By the mandate by which we go to war, the United States does not have authority to invade these areas. In 1970, as I've already mentioned, the invasion of Cambodia. That's one of the reasons, one of the charges brought against Richard Nixon a few years later for impeachment, that he had gone beyond his mandate as president. Therefore, he broke the law. Well, let's just kind of see what happens. We'll end this. Since the United States will not pursue people into Cambodia and Laos, it is the North Vietnamese and also the Viet Cong that dictate the terms of combat. They're the ones who engage, they're the ones who disengage. If they get hurt too much, which is often the case, they retreat into Laos, they retreat into Cambodia, where the United States won't come after them. There's never a time when you've defeated a North Vietnamese unit. It retreats in these areas and you send U.S. combat troops into these other countries to destroy them. That doesn't happen. So they'll take as many casualties as they want to, as long as they can hurt the Americans, even though they're suffering much worse than the Americans are. I was alive during the Vietnam War. I was not in the military. Later on, I joined the Navy Reserves. So I'm not a Vietnam War veteran, but I was kind of aware of what was happening here. The United States was winning every battle, but they were losing the war. Because every time there was combat, we lost American lives. That dug very deeply into the American psyche. Every week, there were announcements on the number of Americans had died. In the good times, it was like 250 men. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, where actually the government made an excuse. They say, well, we can't contact everybody, so we'll just announce the people we can contact. In other words, they're not willing to release the number of people that have actually died. They'll just release it incrementally over the weeks. So rather than 250, 300 men dying every week, after the Tet Offensive, they're announcing 500 per week. This can add up to be something quite vicious. And the Americans, we get war weary. We win every battle, but we lose the war because Americans get war weary. This is a very good example of how a nation with a lot less technical advantages, a lot less firepower, a lot less equipment, can actually outlast a very, very powerful nation. Now, could the United States have won the war? I don't know. Could we have gone over here, invaded Laos, which was illegal? Could we have cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail? This was argued incessantly during the war itself. I'm not sure it was winnable. But let's go back. We are really trying to bring China into this discussion. And China, as I've already mentioned, was involved in helping the North Vietnamese. Would there be a chance, like Korea, if the North Vietnamese had ever gotten to the position where they would lose the war, that the Chinese combat troops would now come in and fight? Maybe it was possible to beat the North Vietnamese. I'm not even sure of that, as the way we were fighting it. But if the North Vietnamese started to lose, and now you got to deal with hundreds of thousands of Chinese, as we did in North Korea, that war is clearly unwinnable. You're not going to beat these people. Something else I want to mention. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated their first nuclear device. So that ratchets up the Cold War dramatically. Now the United States no longer has monopoly on nuclear weapons. So if there is a confrontation in the war, it can't go nuclear. However, by the early 1960s, the Chinese communists also have nuclear weapons. So it's not just like we can come and beat these people on the battlefield. Well, we probably could. But what if it gets ratcheted up to a nuclear exchange? That's one of the reasons why the United States fights a war literally with one hand tied behind their back, because they're afraid of a wider war. On the other hand, the way we were fighting this war was unwinnable. Well, let's go down and talk a little bit more. As you know, the United States cut a deal with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, where we will leave and they will not advance. Of course, we left and they did advance. So the last U.S. combat troops withdrawn in 1973. In 1975, the North Vietnamese, without the United States fighting them, come down and trash the South Vietnamese. Okay, let's go back to China. That's really our point of departure here. Let's look at the Cultural Revolution. Mao is trying to industrialize. Yeah, he's aware of the kind of things that had happened quite awfully up here. Can we say that China does industrialize? Yeah, it has more iron and steel production. That's true. But the cost, of course, was quite extensive. And Mao is getting old now. And if he can possibly change things before he dies, now's the time to do so. He unleashes what we call the Cultural Revolution. let's really change the mentality of China. The communists don't want a throwback to the old Chinese culture. They do try to destroy a lot of things that are Chinese. Some of the old palaces and buildings that where the royal family had lived for centuries are torn down. Actually, in retrospect, the Chinese are probably unhappy that they did this, because now when they bring tourists in, a lot of money in tourism, as you know, from all over the world, people want to see the Great Wall, which they don't tear down. But these other palaces might have been another inducement for have American and other tourists come over and spend their money. However, in the Cultural Revolution, Mao was trying to change the nation culturally. Let's get rid of the intelligentsia. Let's get rid of these people that have a throwback to the way China used to be. You take university professors, you take educated people, you take people that had, before the revolution, had traded with the Americans, traded with other nationalities. You send them out to work in the fields. We know that there is a lot of things that are lost culturally. What is still in dispute is how many people actually died. And that becomes quite challenging. Hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe many million. Remember, I kind of cut off the half century of viciousness largely with 1964. If the Cultural Revolution, we can logically state, did cost the lives of many millions of people, and then we extended 1964 another decade or so, we can say that now we have another huge loss of life. Well, Mao dies in 1976. Remember, I'm afraid of this man. When Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, came to visit Mao in 1960, Mao says, I want to go to war against the United States. I want to go against them right now. You start the war, you give the material, I'll give you the manpower. How much manpower do you want? I'll give you 100 divisions, I'll give you 200 divisions, I'll give you 1,000 divisions. We're taking down the United States. Well, Khrushchev didn't go along with this. However, when Mao dies in 1976, the Chinese realized they would probably have a better idea to cooperate with other nations, including the United States. So rather than blaming Mao for the kinds of things that had gone on, which he clearly had done, there's the Gang of Four that's blamed. These people, his wife is blamed. There's other important leaders who were around at the time. They're not going to blame Mao, but it's like a showpiece trial. We're showing the world that we're backing off from what Mao was doing. We're finding somebody to blame. Remember, China is building up North Vietnam. The Chinese decide to invade North Vietnam. What? They don't really want to have any land. The North Vietnamese, they got their armies down here. The Chinese push in a certain distance. They push in, and of course, well, the North Vietnamese said, we've been invaded, so they're going to send the troops back up here. There was essentially a boundary dispute, according to the Chinese, that brought them across. But there's not an awful lot of combat, yet men are killed. But then the Chinese withdraw. Well, why did they do this? We're blaming people for what's gone on before. And now China is putting distance between the communist North Vietnamese and their own regime. It takes a few decades, but it's now China is one of the biggest trading partners in the world. I'm not going to say it's not still a repressive regime, because it is. But I am going to see, with their huge work ethic, they are producing so many, many things that we're consuming today. So modern China, at least after 1976, is quite a bit different than what we've seen before. I believe I am out of time. My trouble is I shoot my mouth off too much. I am out of time. I'll tell you what, this essentially ends the lecture part of the course. And I will keep you informed by emails about due dates and that kind of thing. And in other words, You stuck it out. I hope I've said a few things that you've enjoyed. I've certainly enjoyed doing this. And I hope to see you again when we can meet in classrooms and see you again in another class. In the meantime, continue to enjoy life, enjoy the good weather, and I'll see you again another time.